Well, hello everyone. Hope you're all doing well. You're recovered from the snowstorm. At least it's getting warmer, except makes the snow a little bit yuckier. So thank you for trudging here today. We are so happy to have you. We're so honored to welcome you here for Women's History Month and in honor of International Women's Day. I'm Avra Siegel. I'm the Deputy Director of the White House Council on Women and Girls, and I have the distinct honor for working for one of the great leaders for women's rights here at home and around the world, and that is Valerie Jarrett. She is the Senior Advisor to President Obama and the Chair of the White House Council on Women and Girls. She is a relentless advocate for these issues. I have learned so much from her, and I'm so honored to introduce her today. So Valerie.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I gave Avra a hug because, as I said to Lloyd a little while ago, he couldn't figure out whether to shake my hand or hug, and I said, in the White House, we are huggers. So that's what we do. And what better day to hug than our International Women's Day, and to launch Women's History Month, and to look around this room and see so many people here who have worked with us closely over the last 5 years. I just want to, on behalf of the President, welcome you to the White House. And let's just give yourselves like a big round of applause to get us started. So as I think you all heard the President say in this year's State of the Union, 2014 is going to be a year of action. That's what we're committed to doing. And we all know that when women succeed, America succeeds. And the same thing is true for women all over the world. And as I look around this audience and I see these amazing, powerful, accomplished, successful women, and a few good men, brave men, let's say, there is no end to what we can do if we work together. And we know that in order for us to have a globally competitive marketplace, we cannot leave behind half of our population. And so we are so looking forward to having this amazing panel discussion in a few minutes so that we can talk about what it is that we're going to actually do to improve the trajectory of our women and girls as they try to compete in this global marketplace. I'd like to especially recognize the members of our panel. And I'll tell you, I'm always amazed at how amazing Avra and our team here is at the White House, because we go from Tina and I sitting around having an idea to everybody actually showing up and being here in about 2 seconds flat. And it doesn't happen because Tina or I decided it should. It happens because of Avra's hard work. And so I think, Avra, you deserve a round of applause too. So our panel is really going to talk about how the public sector, the private sector, and the NGOs can all work together to break down the barriers to women's economic empowerment around the world. And the panel is going to be moderated by our very own Carolyn Atkins, who's the White House Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics. Stand up, so you're going to get a shout out too. Caroline is one of our strongest voices for women's economic empowerment here at the White House, and a terrific partner with whom we collaborate on a daily basis. And she's pressing the President's agenda forward on trade and our international engagements around the G20, and so we're delighted to have you with us. Second, we have Christian Lagarde, Managing Director of the IMF. Christian. One of the world's foremost champions for elevating the issues to the top of the agenda that are important to women and girls, and we're just so excited about the research that IMF released in their Women's Work and Economy report, so congratulations for that. Inez Murray, the CEO of the Global Banking Alliance. Inez. Inez has been a tireless pioneer and advocate for the financial inclusion of women, and so we thank you for everything that you do. And then, near and dear to our heart, Kathleen, wait a minute, not you yet. First, Kathleen Russell, you're coming up, Lloyd, who is the U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues and who leads our international women's agenda with passion and vigor and travels all over the world. So those are the women on the panel. And now, as I said, we always need to have one brave man. So Lloyd Blankman, please stand up, the CEO of Goldman Sachs. Who has a long-standing commitment to women, which I'm going to get to in a moment. But I also wanted to announce what I hope you have already heard, which is that he and Goldman are deepening that commitment to women entrepreneurs around the world by announcing a $50 million investment as a part of a new initiative with the World Bank and And the initiative is going to raise $600 million in capital to help 100,000 women around the world, entrepreneurs in developing countries, take a step forward to help increase and grow their businesses. So, Lloyd, I want to give you a real shout out for that. Thank you for that. And everybody who knows Lloyd knows that behind or next to, or maybe even in front of every good man is a strong woman. So Dina hates it when I do this, but where's Dina Powell? We have to give Dina a shout out because she actually gets all the work done. Where are you? Did she sneak away? Oh, she's hiding. She won't even stand up. She never stands up when I call her. Anyway, so thank you to the panel for coming. We're really delighted to have you here. And so before we begin the panel discussion, I want to introduce somebody to you who's extremely special to me. And I've had the privilege over my life of meeting some pretty special women from all over the world. But there is one who I will never forget, with whom I clicked instantly, and who I believe will be a lifelong friend, and that's Ayo Megbope. Stand up for a second. I want everybody to see you when I talk about you. Now, Ayo and I met 5 years ago at the first CGI 10,000 women dinner that I attended, and it was when the first class was coming to closure, and I was in the very first class. And I will never forget, Dina sat us next to each other at dinner, and from the very first moment I saw this twinkle in her eye, and she, over the course of the dinner, began to describe to me her journey. And the journey was one where, most people would say, oh my gosh, what a challenge. You started on the fourth floor walk up in your kitchen, this catering business, and she told me these stories about how when she would run out of money, she would just go to her husband and ask for more money. Never occurred to her to actually have a checking account and save or borrow. She just kept going to her husband. Well, eventually there was enough of that, and he's like, that's not the way we're going to do business. And fortunately, she found 10,000, was selected by 10,000 women. And I will say to you, by the end of the dinner, I said, this is just a remarkable entrepreneur, that the sky is the limit. And over the last 5 years since then, she's moved out of that fourth floor walk-up. She now has started her own freestanding business. She has a catering business in addition to everything else that she's doing, but just a remarkable, tender, warm, good spirit who had a great idea, and she had the gift and the talent to develop that idea. All she needed was a little help. And there are people like you all over the world who are just waiting for that little bit of help. And so really congratulations again to Lloyd and to the whole team at Goldman who've worked so hard to make miracles happen, miracles that should have happened. All they just needed was that little bit of an edge up. And so it's really my privilege to introduce to you a woman with humor, grace, talent, wit, charm, an infectious smile, a twinkle in her eye, who is setting, literally, the world on fire. Please join me in welcoming Ayo.
Thank you, Valerie, for your kind introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ayo, and I was part of the very first class of 10,000 women. I will always remember the day I met Valerie 5 years ago. Valerie has been very supportive. At every opportunity, you taught me to believe in myself and push my limits. You showed me that powerful women can pull so many others up with them. And so I just told you I started my MBA program with the Manchester Business School. I started my catering business, No Leftovers Nigeria Limited, in 2007 with a seed capital of $8. I was walking from my home, a fourth-floor walk-up apartment. My first customers were my family and friends. Looking back now, I realized that sustaining my business was the easy part. The hard part has been sustaining and growing it. Starting my business was the easy part. The hard part has been sustaining and growing it. Before I enrolled in 10,000 Women, I was selling bean cakes every day, but I couldn't account for all my hard work. I realized that while I had cooking skills, I also needed business and management skills to succeed. 10,000 Women helped me organize my finances, and I opened a bank account. It gave me confidence in myself as a business leader and introduced me to a new network of women entrepreneurs to learn from. I also learned how to delegate. Even more importantly, I learned how to hire and retain qualified staff. I invest in my employees and their families too, and so we all grow together. Since participating in the 10,000 Women program, I have moved into a dedicated facility and opened a restaurant. My revenue has increased 30-fold, and I have hired over 50 full-time and part-time employees. My business keeps growing as I find new opportunities. Just a few days ago, I used my profits to purchase a new delivery truck and hired 2 new employees. My business cannot keep up with current demand because we don't have enough staff or even the physical space to fill up any more orders. Most people will say this is a good problem to have, but the truth is, as a business owner, all I see is missed opportunities. I have tried to access a loan to expand my catering facility, but unfortunately, the bank requirements are too difficult to meet. One bank asked me to put down 70% of the capital, and another asked for a land title as collateral, which unfortunately I do not have. 10,000 Women has brought me so much and has taught me so much, and I have new ideas for my business, including moving into food processing and packaging. With an investment capital, there is absolutely no limit to what I can accomplish. Thank you so much for listening, and God bless.
Well, thank you so much, Io. It's stories like yours and of other women like you around the world that really inform what kinds of policies and programs we all need to work hard on to really help grow our economy and help support women entrepreneurs around the world. So thank you for that. Now I want to introduce our formidable panel to stage, and let's get this show started.
Thank you very much. A special thank you, of course, to Io. And may I just say, Valerie just asked me to let you all know that this is being streamed live over the IMF website. So we hope that many people, not just those in this room, are also able to enjoy it. The White House website, I beg your pardon, and the White House website. Thanks, Avra. So I wanted to say that it's such an exciting time now. We heard this incredible story from Io, but we've all heard stories through our working lives of individuals who have done well and individuals who've been helped. I think what's exciting now is that this is a more general mood in the country, in the world, of understanding that it's not just about the social, moral, ethical idea of helping women or fairness. There's also hard economic logic behind that. And that's why we have, and I want to turn first to the panelist on my left, Christine Lagarde, who, of course, has, like many of us, been fighting for women and women's empowerment over the years, but is also the head of perhaps the hardest-headed international organization and financial organization, the International Monetary Fund. So, Christine, what can the IMF actually do to help move governments so that they understand the importance of women in the economy?
Thank you, Caroline, and good afternoon to all of you. First of all, I think it started at home, and I'd like to recognize in the audience some of the women at the IMF who helped me carry the women's cause a little bit further in that organization, which is extremely talented, but highly dominated by, I would say, a male culture. So you have to, in my view, start from your base and decide that you're going to really take this theme, this cause further. What we did was, put our analytical skills to the service of women, and why does it matter? Why does it make economic sense? Well, from a macroeconomic point of view, which is our core business, what does it bring to actually encourage women to the job market, to the workforce, to the financing, which, as you said, IO is so needed. So we published, not so long ago, a study that is called Women, Growth and the Economy. And that study has been circulated around and has the stamp of the IMF, and is actually demonstrating the fact that half of the women in the world are not working, so they are underutilized. And those women that work, well, you find many of them either underpaid or not paid at all, because they belong to the informal society where you can't track payment, which makes me say that they are overexploited. So they are both underutilized and overexploited. And yet, when you actually demonstrate what they can bring to the economy, you soon realize that they can really increase the GDP of the countries that they can work in, that they can develop the standard of living for the entire population. And we've made some, sort of model calculations, because that's the way the IMF works. And it can really raise GDP from anywhere by about 7% to about 27%. India is the point in case where really GDP could increase significantly, and the same is true for some of the Middle East countries. So that's first thing we did. General study, focus on what the benefits could be if women could access the job market and the workplace. Second thing we do is, we go under the skin of each and every economy that is a member of the institution. And when we do that, we also try to identify on a country-by-country basis, in the dialogue that we have with policymakers, what women can bring, how they can be helpful, how policies can be changed in order to accommodate women's needs, in order to open it, and in order to remove obstacles. And there are plenty of them. I'll be happy to mention a few. And I would like to mention one example of a country that has actually gone a long way already, and that is Japan. Japan, about a year and a half ago, we did a specific study on the Japanese market. And I took it to Japan. I participated in the real launch of the study that was done by members of staff of the IMF. I took it to the finance minister. I took it to Prime Minister Abe. And I was only thrilled to see that Prime Minister Abe, in addition to his 3 arrows, has now decided, given the aging of the Japanese population, given the problem that they have with identifying talented workforce, which is plenty because the women are extremely well trained and educated, but, as I said, underutilized, has now decided to open plenty of new childcare centers and to make sure that women in Japan could access the job market. He's championing that cause. The governor of the Central Bank of Japan, who is very famous at the moment because he's changed the monetary policy, goes around the world saying that the labor market reform is critical and that women must have access to the job market. I was attending the G20 that you're familiar with, Caroline. In addition to Japan, I was so pleased to see that Korea has made it part of their program as well, and will change some of their policies in order to open the market to Korean women. Now, if that can be done in Japan and in Korea, it can be done in many other places as well. So we will just keep at it. And just by way of conclusion, 2 or 3 policies that can be changed to facilitate access to women that, the policymakers can look at. First of all, tax system. When you have a tax system that is based on the family unit, it's clearly a disadvantage to the second bread earner. Who is the second bread earner in most cases? Women. Second set of policies that have been successfully implemented by, say, the Netherlands is, labor market reforms that eliminate obstacles and discrimination against part-time employees. Who is a part-time employee for part of their life? Women. That's a second example of how things can be changed. There are plenty others, but I'm sure that you want other speakers to take the floor as well.
Yes, and I want to actually, since you mentioned the G20, to say that we in the United States, and encouraged very much by Valerie and her team, have put together a proposal for the work plan of the G20 this year, which I spoke about a little yesterday in a G20 session, which is to improve and increase female labor force participation, and for every government to think about plans that they can have and specific policies, as Christine mentions, that can be put in place for that. But I want to turn to Kathy, who, as Valerie said, flies around the world, talks to a lot of governments, and understands perhaps as well as anybody what are some of the toughest barriers to persuading governments to change. Kathy.
Well, Caroline, I think the interesting thing is almost wherever you go, there are some barriers. The question is just whether what they are in different countries. We've identified 4 that you see almost everywhere. One is access to markets. The second, and that includes things like permits, mobility, corruption, and these affect women differently than they affect men. You know, corruption is a good example, or let's say permits, because corruption sort of fits into that. A lot of times women, at sort of every stage where they try to get permits, they're just at a little bit less of an advantage than men because they don't really know how the system works. They don't usually have the access to sort of funds to pay off bribes, things like that. So every stage along the way, they have problems. Access to capital, obviously, that's a problem that I think Lloyd can talk about because that's something that we see all the time. But that also includes things like finance, land, technology, and it's also, women are frequently what we call time poor, which is in addition to everything else they're trying to do, they're raising their children, they're taking care of the family. Women have skills gaps in many places. You know, that can be tied to a lack of education. And again, it varies from country to country, but it's something that we see consistently place to place. And finally, you know, we have an issue with women's leadership, and that can be kind of a lack of women's networks, cultural barriers, childcare, as Christine mentioned, a lack of role models. And so in every country, you know, you see some version of these in one or another. And I think what we try to do, and just on the policy level, is look for opportunities to address these. And we do these, as you mentioned, through different fora. One is the G20, through APEC, through the Equal Futures Initiative that the President launched here, but really look for opportunities where we can share experiences and try to help countries do better and try to find ways to help them kind of overcome these barriers so that women have a little bit better options moving into these markets.
So Lloyd, what's the business case? I know that you have this very exciting new initiative launched today, but before getting to that, I'd be interested to hear from you as a businessman, hard-headed businessman, and in a world of hard-headed, soft-hearted maybe. But anyway, what is the business case?
Yes. First, listen, I'd also like to thank everybody who's come, but I'd also want to thank Valerie. We wouldn't be in this place, Valerie, if you hadn't been. Valerie's come to multiple graduations. She's rolled up her sleeves. She's coached people who've been in this program. So again, I want to thank you very much for that. You know, there are multiple business cases. When we first started in, we were looking, frankly, for a white space, an empty space. I mean, that's never a virtue except if you're looking for one to fill, and you have the resources to fill it, where we could invest $1 and get the highest return. And when we looked around the world, and don't forget, there were a confluence of a number of streams going for us. We're in international businesses. We have an emerging market bias in our business because our business correlates with growth, and we follow growth around the world, and the highest growth areas are doing it. We like the women's space also because we were looking around and looking at our own metrics and our own anxiety. We have a lot of anxieties ourselves about this question about how to recruit, but increasingly recruiting is not the problem, how to retain women in our business, and because they're terrific, but guess what? They don't always stay. And I look at the proportionality at every stage, and it starts off at 50%, and it goes, and by the time you get to the senior-most people in the firm, it ebbs down to 20%, like most other firms like ourselves. And maybe we do a little bit better, but that's not much better. We looked at all those positions and looked for the confluence of these ideas. And you mentioned Japan. We had our own Kathy Mitsui about 10 years ago wrote a piece, she's our research person in Japan, wrote a piece called Womanomics. And that was cited in the op-ed that Prime Minister Abe wrote, and she's getting a little bit delayed, but she's getting a lot of attention in Japan. She got a lot of attention outside of Japan for a long time. And she wrote about what would the Japanese economy look like if women participated in the same proportion that men do, with the same result. And it was staggering. And the confluence of all those ideas led us to 10,000 women and a bit of trial and error along the way. Mini MBA, kind of a curriculum, negotiating, putting together a balance sheet, mentorship, discipline programs, having to turn in a plan and having to have it approved, that kind of connection. And over time, it evolved 6 years later into something that produced the 10,000, which of course we grow from there. That's the business case, and it's the greatest return on investment that you can have. You can go and compete with everybody else who's going to invest in people that other people are investing in, but this was a kind of an empty area. And I'll just say what else is in a business case for us. If you work, if you're in the pharmaceutical industry, you get to that industry because you believe in the power of drugs to change and improve people's lives. If you're going into finance, you have to believe in markets, and you have to believe that what you're doing is more than just earning a living, but that you're accomplishing something in your life. Those are the kind of people we attract, and those are the kind of people we want to retain. So much of what we do is on an institutional scale. Very little is on a human scale. So the business case was not only what we did for the women, the business case is what we did for the people at Goldman Sachs, because we got to do a program where people in Goldman Sachs got to work with people like Io and see what it means not to give philanthropy to write a check, but what to give to somebody to push somebody over a hump and allow them to produce a business that produces profits, allows them to hire other people who then go out and invest in their families and accrete wealth. And that kind of virtuous circle is what is theoretically done in the great macro world, but it's pretty nice and rewarding to see it done on a human scale. So that was our business case, personally, apart from what we do for the women in the program.
Thanks very much. So, Inez, I'd like to hear, in your work, you look very much at the finance, access to credit and business and so on. And again, in the G20, and we have looked and had goals for financial inclusion, which we found quite hard to make progress on. So I wonder what advice you would give in that area, what your experience tells you about why it is that when women, I believe women entrepreneurs account for more than 1/3 of small and medium-sized enterprises, but they get less than 10% of the total credit.
Sure, thank you very much. And hello, Mum, in Dublin. Really very grateful to be up here with such a great set of panelists. We really have to prove the business case. And I work in an organization that's an alliance of banks, 34 banks, commercial banks around the world. And in our alliance are banks that have indeed proven the business case. And what the business case shows is that women are profitable. They tend to have higher repayment rates. They have higher average balances in their savings accounts. They tend to buy more product from the single bank, and they have higher net promoter scores. So when the banks in our network are looking at the business case, they're looking at the profitability of the customers, and they have that data. At the same time, there's loads of banks that don't actually know anything about this segment, right? There's no awareness in a lot of commercial banks that women are actually a viable segment. So there's a lack of awareness, and then there's a lack of data. So data meaning a lot of banks don't know how to find women in the marketplace. So when they look at SME, they already think it's perceived actually to be an expensive thing to do. So in the United States, you can't make a small business loan for less than $150,000. So how can we kind of take cost out of that lending approach? And what kind of other data sources can we bring into that underlying risk assessment, underwriting, in order to reduce the cost, I think is very important in SME lending. But then as far as women's concerned, most banks cannot disaggregate their customer data by sex. So they cannot actually tell you how how their women are performing those portfolios. So that data piece is a critical missing link. Then we're moving on, let's say, to the business case. And I think we do have good examples of business cases. And just like yesterday at the UN, there was a meeting and we were discussing this idea of the solutions hub. We need to codify those best practices so that everybody knows that they exist, and really share amongst banks. And in our network, what we try to do is really, if you belong to our network, is you really have to share that information, and that's part of the commitment. It's a quid pro quo. You join the network, you get access to other banks' information. It's proprietary information. They open up their doors. You can come and have a study tour and talk to bankers. I think bankers need to be persuaded by bankers. I think being persuaded by technical assistance providers, they want to talk to people that have actually been responsible for P&L for this. And that's what they really relate to. So there's a number of things that we need to do to support banks to get into this space. And I think the initiative announced this morning with Goldman and the IFC is a perfect example of two major global brands pulling together their core competencies, the strongest investment bank in the world and one of the best TA providers in the world. No, seriously, the best IFC. Pulling together those set of core competencies and really making a big play and demonstrating that we're in this for the long haul. Likewise, I thought today the launch of this credit where credit is due. I mean, power of the purse for me was the first time you really saw a major bank get behind and analyzing what quantifying that opportunity. And then today we have this, which shows extraordinary potential if we do integrate women into the labour market in terms of GDP growth. So I think there's a lot of potential to really build this on this momentum.
I want to get you to talk a little bit about what the difficulties are. It's great to have, and perhaps we've flipped it the wrong way because we had some of the proposals for improvement at the beginning from Christine, which were very helpful. But in particular, and going back to Lloyd, on this program that has been announced this morning, how do you think that, is it about helping the bankers to know more? Is it about helping the individuals that want to get access to credit to know more? How would it bring people together?
Credit and risk capital, of course, because that's where the rubber meets the road. Everything else, you can train people, you know what you're investing. You lend somebody money, you have to hope it gets back so you can recycle it. So that's risk, and the point is to do the credit work. It doesn't make sense, as was pointed out, in the United States unless it's under 150,000. So you want to have, all this feeds into something, which I'll use the word, scale. How do you scale something? How do you scale $10,000 loans, $20,000 loans? You could be, in the study here it talks about the same analysis was applied to Japan gets applied to the BRIC countries and then 11, and our calculus is a 12% add on that basis to GDP. But you create that 12% surge in GDP, if you'll excuse me, one IO at a time. And 10,000 could be a drop in the bucket. So how do you scale this operation? If this were again, making an analogy to another industry, if this was a pharmaceutical and a test kit for the FDA, the results have been proven so good they'd stop the test and they'd start issuing the drug. And the question is, how do you achieve that scale? And which is why I think the partnership between ourselves, because at the end of the day, we're still a commercial venture, we're not a national entity or a supranational entity. So the idea of the partnerships, and let me tell you, we've gone a lot with the kindness of strangers. We've had a lot of partners who are working on all education partners, financing partners, teaching. But this last step of partnering with an institution that has the wherewithal to command capital and also the capability of distributing it in a sensible way and collecting it and servicing it, that's a big deal. For us, scale, scale, scale. How do you do more of it?
Thanks. So, Christine, I want to turn back to you about how this is all about getting the capital providers to understand more. But as Lloyd said, he's not a supranational. Of course, the IFC is, but the IMF is also about scale and how to impress upon governments that this is something that's worth it for them. And then I'd also like to go to Kathy afterwards and ask a little bit about not just the big macro picture, but also the individual picture, because many of us here in this world of finance, we know we're generally in a minority amongst women. Jane Harmon is in the audience. She was, chair of the Intelligence Committee. That's also not a usual background for, it's not a usual place to find women. We know in our national security staff that it's hard, we believe in diversity, it's hard to find diversity. So I'd like to also press a little bit on that. But first to you, Christine, about governments and making the case there.
Well, as I said, I think there is policy advice, there is surveillance that we can do, there is holding governments accountable for the promises that they make. And there is the role model issue as well. So as we were saying, if Japan can demonstrate that they can address the aging population issue that they have to deal with by changing the norms, by transforming the culture, by opening the job markets, by setting standards from the top with the Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, Governor of central banks, all singing from the same hymn song, then that's a very convincing case. And it should certainly indicate to other governments around the world that, yes, it works, and it makes business sense, and it makes economic sense, and it has consequences for the standard of living of the entire population. I would like to add just a couple of points. One is, as you said, women are good workers because they're well-trained, they are, as I said, overexploited, underutilized, and as a result, when they are rightly utilized and not exploited, they are good workers. That's demonstrated study after study after study, whether it's Goldman Sachs, whether it's McKinsey, whether it's Catalyst, everybody demonstrates it. They are good spenders because they tend to spend on, the things that will help the next generation, much more so than men. And that's also a really important matter. Now, 2 points that I would like to make, and I realize that I might be a little bit out of your question, but point number one, I think the banks better wake up, because between the fund crowding, the use of technology on a massive scale, as is possible in some of the emerging market economies where the retail banking is not yet very strong, I think banks will soon be seeing competitors that they had no idea about, that will be coming sideways from, totally unexpected places, and that will actually tap the women, because the women will be good reimburser, good borrowers. So I think they should be careful. Now, without, applauding Goldman Sachs too much, I would like to ask Lloyd to describe one practice that they have inside their firm, which I think is absolutely terrific, to encourage women to actually come back to the workplace after they've disappeared at a time which is, as we all know, sensitive between the age of 30-ish and under 40. Because I think you have something called the returnee program or something of that nature, which is just smart, makes business sense for you, but it serves the women's purpose to re-enter the workforce after a certain time. Is that okay, Caroline?
That's totally fine. I wanted to ask
Thank
him
you,
about
Christine.
it too.
I'll say, I will say the most flattering thing I can about the program. It didn't evolve as anything to subsidize or support women. It was totally our venal, selfish, greedy effort to get talented people into our firm, which is, by the way, the most stable and enduring motivation there could possibly be. So that's how you'll know we'll keep doing it. But we have problems keeping people in general. We work people, as everybody knows, like dogs, keeping them in mid-career. What we're having to do, let me tell you, there's a lot of advantages and pleasures in being in the business as well, but the pressures around women when they sometimes leave, even though their careers are going well, even though we kill ourselves to support them sometimes, they go, raise children, and then guess what? They're still who they were when they left, and we try to get them back. And so what we do is we have another training program for people in mid-career who otherwise missed a few years and missed a few turns of evolution in financial products, in the markets, in what happened in between. And guess what? We teach it to them. That's a lot less expensive than starting from scratch with a 22-year-old getting out of college. And so purely for the benefit of Goldman Sachs, we find ourselves doing something that serves the interest of mid-career women.
I wonder if the IMF, the US government, and other places could think about a similar kind of practice, because we're all, as one of you said, time poor. Kathy, I think it was you. So maybe I can turn to you and get your reaction to that, but also to other government suggestions and ways that you work with them, and a bit about yourself.
Well, I would say this. I think one thing that I try to do when I work with other governments is try to approach them with some modesty about what's happening in the United States. And I think it's useful to remember that until the mid-'70s, women in this country sometimes had to have their husbands help them, get a credit card. I do a lot of work on violence issues, and I worked on the Violence Against Women Act, which we passed here in 1994. Until then, the domestic violence numbers here were very high. They're still high, but they're much better than they were. It took us a long time to get that bill passed, and we've made a lot of progress in that field, but it's taken a long time. And so when we go to other countries and say, you need to do X, Y, and Z, a lot of times they hear it as the United States dictating what needs to happen, and in some cases in many cases, they're annoyed. In some cases, they just feel that we're so far ahead. And I say, we're not really. I mean, it hasn't been that long that we've gotten a lot of things done, and your countries will move ahead quickly, too, if you take some of these steps. I think that there's no question that it's very challenging. Japan is so interesting, especially for me to use now when I go out and talk, because I say, what Prime Minister Abe is saying is, we moved ahead without our women, and look what happened. And now we've got to go back and bring them forward. And this was a tremendous problem. And you and I were together in Japan with the Vice President. And I think that's a very interesting story for other countries to hear, because they're a lesson of what not to do. And I think countries are hearing that. And I think the fact that Prime Minister Abe is being so forthright about the mistakes they've made is really useful for other countries to hear. So I hope that answers your questions. Yeah. I mean, I think in the policy area, there's a lot to do for every country. I mean, there are so many countries where the laws are just very challenging for many reasons, where inheritance laws make it difficult for women to inherit property, where there are some laws where women, I won't name the country, but there's a law where if you get married and you own property, your husband then has control over that property, even if it was yours coming into the marriage. I mean, there are very challenging laws in many parts of the world that women have to face. And so there are barriers in all sorts of ways, but I think I'm confident. I come at this in a very optimistic way, and I feel like we're making progress, and I think these multilateral forums that we work in are really useful, and I think that countries are coming together and really looking for opportunities to work together. And maybe I shouldn't say this, but the Equal Futures Partnership, at the beginning, I wasn't really clear about how that was going to go forward, but countries are so enthusiastic about that, I think because it's such high-level participation, and because it's an opportunity for countries to work together in ways that they didn't even anticipate when they came into it. And I think what we see going forward is perhaps places where A and B country can work together with country C, who maybe needs help in an area. So I think there are lots of opportunities going forward for all of us to work together, we know now what the challenges are. Everybody has pretty much agreed that women are essential, that, I'm like the worst person for sports in the world, but essentially, you can't play a game with half your team out there or with one arm behind your back or whatever those sports analogies are. It just doesn't work, right? Everybody gets that now. And so it's a question of what do you do about it? And we have a pretty good idea what to do. The private sector is doing some great work. Multilaterals are doing some great work. We just all need to sort of work together and coordinate our efforts so that we can move into the future in a really productive way.
Yes, and I think when you talked about your work on domestic violence and so on, some of the interesting research that has been done shows that women who have no property rights and less access to finance actually suffer more from domestic violence. And it shows clearly the kind of power relationship. Mm-hmm. And so there is a sense, I agree with you, of course, there is grounds for optimism, and probably if one imagined 10 years ago, there wouldn't have been a panel like this. There wouldn't have been Goldman Sachs supporting the kind of program that there are. The IMF certainly didn't write such a paper as it just has, and the Japanese Prime Minister wasn't arguing for female labor force participation. So things have certainly changed and are changing, and it is encouraging to think about how those elements feed on one another. I want to turn back to Inez about this critical point of what does it do for the women themselves and for business when they have more access to banks and to credit, and also to ask you to pick up on Christine's challenge about, well, all very well to get banks to understand better that women can be great customers for them, but they may already be too late on that, or if they don't move quickly, they will be too late because there will be technologies that cut them out.
Yeah, sure. So to your first point, it's not just access to finance. It's access to information, education, and markets, right? So the banks in our network are actually providing all four pieces of that value proposition, and that's really integral. And they're working within an ecosystem, and the ecosystem has other actors in it that help support. So it is initiatives like 10,000 Women, it's universities, it's training institutes, it's women's business associations that do advocacy and so on. So it's not just the bank. The bank needs support in developing the market of women entrepreneurs to come to the doors and then be onboarded correctly. So that, Westpac, for instance, one of our network members, does a survey of women SMEs, actually all SMEs, about 4,000 SMEs every year, and 1,500 of them are women, and 45% of women did not know how to do projected cash flows in Australia, right? So that you would see, so that's an example of a core piece of know-how that really any small business needs to know. And so what that bank did, they internally have their own financial education unit called the Davidson Institute, and they put on these targeted seminars to really meet that market need. But they did that in a way that's really, they're demonstrating a return on investment, because the kind of brand building that they're doing with that community is so substantial, and they're able to measure it. So to Christine's point, indeed, many different actors are coming into the financial services space and are going to pick off various profitable pieces of banks' business at the consumer level. Unless banks get it, start getting this idea that they need to find the sweet spot between business value and customer value. And that value, really, when you look at the data, if you can bring a woman in, like yourself over there, make you a loyal customer, you will always remember that bank. You will support other women to come into that bank. We're seeing a lot of potential, talk about scale, Lloyd, we're seeing a lot of potential if we catalyse networks of women that are customers of banks already, so that they can mentor each other and coach each other and provide access to business opportunity. Women get empowered by sharing information. They want to help each other. Is that an innate thing? I don't know. But it is true, and it's been observed time and again with our banks that are doing these programs. They're watching these networks. Look at what American Express has done with Small Business Saturday. It's absolutely incredible, the kind of networking that's happening. And that's viral, and it's organic, and the institution itself doesn't get involved. It just catalyses it, and we can kind of, through that approach. So I believe that if banks take this on in earnest, they will indeed compete against the smaller actors that are just picking away at various pieces of their business.
Well, that's very cheering as well. And I think that we, as Kathy said, getting now time poor, and I want to leave room for Valerie to say a few closing words. But before I do that, perhaps I can just turn back to Christine to say, what do you think is the most important thing that I should say that here in the United States, and I like Kathy's point that we haven't got it right here. We know that, and it's important for us also to be to admit that and to look for ways that we can improve and change. But what are the most important things that we can all come together to agree on? Is it about female labor force participation? Is it some other aspect of change? Is it about the financial inclusion? Or is it about everybody continuing to do, whether it's public, private, banking, individual education stories themselves? Thank you.
I'd say the world over, the key thing and the key investment is investing in education of girls. That's, you know, the best way to help, to develop, and to move on. Yeah. But then if you ask me specifically for the United States, because I've lived in other places in the world, I think that there are lots of opportunities, lots of openings, lots of people who are prepared to do business. I think what's a real issue in this country is how can parents, and I say parents on purpose, can, you know, both have and raise children while continuing their professional life. And the lack of childcare centers, the lack of infrastructure, the lack of ways to deal with it, which some countries have addressed successfully, is really, I think, a crying need in this country.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of our panelists.
I'll just be 2 seconds. Well, thank you for a terrific panel. Thank you, Caroline, for moderating. One more round of applause for the panel. A few other comments I want to make. First of all, I see Tina Brown is in the audience. Later today, she is having an event on women in the world, and so we will be able to continue this conversation there. So where's Tina? I thought I saw her here. Well, you know what? Maybe she left to go to the conference. So that's another marker. Also, the White House is sponsoring a summit on working families late spring, early summer. And so we certainly will continue this conversation there. And anyone who's here today who wants to participate in that, please just reach out to Avra. We would love to have you engaged. We're going to be doing a series of convenings between now and the summit to make sure we have the most diverse breadth of ideas to put on our agenda. It's only one day, and already we're having a hard time figuring out how we're going to squeeze everything into one day. I also want to mention that I saw John Rogers in the audience, who's the chairman of the Goldman Sachs Foundation. So shout out to you. Wave. You get a lot of credit as well. Lloyd and Dina couldn't do what they do without your complete, full support. And to everyone in the audience, everybody who's been watching online, we just want to thank you for your commitment. This was just a snapshot. It's the beginning of the month. And I'd also mention that every day this month, we have a different secretary or department head within the federal government who's doing a blog about what their agency has done over the last 5 years to support women and girls. So I encourage you to go on to the White House website and take a look at that. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.